Welcome to The State of Us. Real people with honest opinions and the future of responsible media. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Thank you all for tuning in. China and the U.S. are experiencing a straining relationship. Mike Pompeo was visiting Beijing on Monday, and the talks got off to a bit of a chilly start, as reported by the Wall Street Journal. So we're going to look at a few different things going on in regards to China. We've got their trade talks, the political situation, North Korea, and some security concerns, as well as what's going on with China's currency. So all of this will culminate in a decision, the question that we'll be answering by the end of the episode. Could this hard-nosed approach that the Trump administration is taking with China, as it did with Mexico and Canada, work? We'll find out what Lance and I think, but of course we can't begin the conversation without him.
Your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
All kinds of stuff going on with Asia. North Korea, South Korea, the yuan, China, trade talks, devaluation of currency. My goodness.
There's a lot of stuff.
Was this part of President Trump's plan all along?
Could be.
Destabilize the Chinese economy. I don't know.
Why do people care, Lance? In 30 seconds, tell us. I mean, why do people care?
Well, number one, you have as you pointed out in our discussion earlier, you have the two largest economies in the world that are clashing, battling, trying to work things out, whatever comparison you want to try to do. They're going head to head. We've been worried about China trying to, quote, take over the United States, either economically or militarily since the fall of the Soviet Union, i.e. now Russia. So now you have some things here. You also have all of the talks with North Korea. North Korea's main supporter being China, then / Russia. And here you are now having trouble with China, and you probably need the Chinese government's help to push the president of North Korea into some of these ideas that the United States wants to do. And the trade wars. And you think about the prices of things that you're going to pay when you go to Walmart or Target or wherever you do your shopping, and how many things come to the United States through China, if not from China, at least through China or a Chinese subsidiary or company or Chinese-backed investment somewhere in Southeast Asia, and what's going to happen to prices. So is that 30 seconds?
I think so. Okay. Well, that's probably the biggest thing for you as an individual, right? That you're going to see the largest effect on it is, what do I pay for the things that I buy at the store, whether that be a pair of jeans, food. It's
a good thing you got that 2 or 3% raise in that tax cut, because now you could see prices rise. And that's one of the worries that we're seeing the stock investors are playing. You know, what is the role of inflation and the Fed with all of its interest hikes and everything else? They're trying to control inflation. And I know for a lot of us, it's like, what's all that mean? Well, basically what they're trying to do is hold down prices so that your raise and your tax cut aren't eaten up in higher prices when you go shopping.
The Wall Street Journal on October 9th reported that a rare public confrontation between the top U.S. and Chinese diplomats marked a new level in the worsening relations between the world's two biggest economies and risked complicating an anticipated summit meeting between President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo exchanged testy words with Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Beijing on Monday.
That's why you read the text.
I think I got close on that one. At a critical moment for U.S.-China relations, with trade negotiations stalled, military talks halted, and both sides blaming each other for a recent close encounter between their warships in the South China Sea. So to simplify what's happening politically, basically it's as the Wall Street Journal so eloquently puts, diplomatic spat adds risk to cooperation. So that's what it is. It's a little bit of a spitting match on, well, they did this and they did that and on both sides. well, the mean U.S. did this, and China's an evil, corrupt, and all that good stuff. So that's kind of what I think is going on politically here, but it lends itself to these have all been capped, I think, by the strong stance that the Trump administration has decided to take on trade with China. And that leads us to the first thing that I want to make sure we cover, which is the currency issue. China's effort to support its slowing economy is heaping pressure and signaling challenges for Beijing as it tries to stimulate growth and rising trade tensions without triggering capital outflows. So it's really not a secret from the U.S. perspective, right, that China manipulates its currency
exactly
to its advantage.
And that's been one of the things that President Trump's policies have been trying to address.
Yeah, is not liking this. But why? Well, what problem, Lance, as you see it, do we face here with where China is in this kind of sticky situation of they're keeping it devalued to a certain extent, but at the same time, there's that sweet spot of if it falls too low, that's a problem, and if we let it get too high, if inflation sets in, that could be a problem too. In layman's terms, I mean, why do we care about what China's currency is doing? Why does that matter?
Well, because it's going to manipulate, they're trying to manipulate the trade sanctions that the U.S. government has levied on it so that they can continue to make money. But when you're manipulating the currency, whether you do it the way we do it or you do it the way they do it, it doesn't matter. Every country does it. I mean, we do it by raising and lowering interest rates, and we say that's okay. And they do it by their communist dictatorial government who can just say, well, we're going to do this and do it. So I don't know, but where it comes down is they're trying to fight the tariff issue. And what's going to happen is if China goes into some kind of recession or economic downfall, it's going to cause instability in the world, I guess. And so that's a concern of mine. And then it's going to change the way trade is done and the availability of goods and the prices of goods. And so, it's kind of a twofold thing. And I guess prices are what most people would be concerned with. I'm more concerned with the instability of a major economic player and someone who has been trying to become powerful enough to take on the United States. And you don't want to do this. I guess I have to bring up World War I. You start this nationalist trend and you start upsetting the apple cart and you make people feel like you're attacking them, whether you actually are or not. Sometimes the only recourse is to come out swinging. And I'm not going to go down that road and say, oh my gosh, we're provoking a war with China. I'm not going to go that far and say that, but these are the first steps in something like that happening. Yeah. Not that that will be the end game here, and not that that's what anybody wants, but it's things like this that you go back and study history. This is what starts conflicts like that, is when you start messing with another country's economy to the point that they don't feel like they have any other recourse other than to take up arms against you. And there was a standoff in the South China Sea last week between U.S. and Chinese warships. They both claimed they had right to be in the water. So it's not like, no, that's not getting covered, but that did take place in military maneuvers in the region last week.
Well, and I think a lot of people...
And you're trying to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, and you need China's help to do that. There's a lot of instability that this could cause.
Well, there's a lot that hangs in the balance. It's more than just, will I pay more for a pair of pants? It's not just that. There's a number of different factors that come into play on other things that the U.S. wants to achieve that are affected by this. Now, as we examine this, I think it's important to make sure that we look at the recent agreement with Canada and Mexico. Even though most of NAFTA remains in the new USMCA, there are still some wins that the U.S. got that it was after. Obviously, it's not a complete apples to apples because Mexico and Canada are not the same as China. for any number of reasons, aside from the size of their economies not being close to the same scale as China's, but also because militarily they have been very close allies of ours for a very long time. And it's not really very likely that relations would degrade that far. And it's not likely because we're intertwined in a similar, especially when you look at Canada, lots of cross-cultural things that have happened. We've gotten very used to these neighbors. They've gotten used to us. So there's a lot of that where it's just different. We're separated by a massive ocean between us and China. There's not nearly the same level of integration. And the reality is they're not an ally. So there's all of that comes into play, I think, that we have to take into consideration when can a tough approach on China work kind of thing. On the other hand, there's a lot of good indication that China respects, even if they don't publicly acknowledge it, strength. Whether or not it's beneficial to them, part of their culture is, respecting that kind of position. So they may not admit it, but there's definitely the possibility that a, little to no compromise stance by the U.S. is one that they have respect for. Again, they may not like what we're doing, but there's that starting point of it might not be as bad as us. And this is where you get into, we've kind of done a little bit of this. Our president has insults, public insults in particular are ones that they strongly dislike. When you speak out against their character or their moral standing, they don't like that very well.
Well, and they like to follow protocol in public.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't.
Very formal.
When Pompeo was there, and they didn't follow public protocol at all. And that is, in the recent history of China in the last 30 years, that's a sure sign that they're upset.
Yeah.
That they don't like the way they're being treated. And not only do they not like it, but they think they're being treated unfairly, that they're being blamed for things
that aren't their fault.
That really aren't their fault. Now, whether you agree with that or not, you still have to deal with the reality
of what they think,
that this is the way they feel, and what it might cause them to do or cause them to react in a certain manner because they feel like they're being unrightfully blamed for things.
Sure. Well, nobody likes that. I mean, I don't know about you, but the last thing that I ever want, right, is to get blamed for something I didn't do.
Right. But nobody, and you say, well, no, I'm okay with it, but I can tell by your demeanor that you're not. That's where we are with China. You can tell by the way they're responding that no matter what they're saying in public, they really don't like what's been going on for the last 6 months, which may be exactly what President Trump wants. And he's hoping that this policy will cause the Chinese to fold. Historically, that's not the way the Chinese play the game, though. They play to win. And so they're going to come back with something that they think can counter this and put them and give them the upper hand.
Yeah. Well, and that's where I think as we examine this, what we have to look at next is with trade and North Korea, both fallouts of what happens politically, which is kind of what the politics is based on. And that's, I wish we could kind of boil it down more than we are, but part of it is that it is complicated because there's a number of different angles that all affect each other. And you could start from any angle. I mean, like if you wanted to start from the North Korea angle, we could have done that and talked about it from that perspective. We're talking about it more from the political perspective, but I just want people to keep that in mind as we're going through this, that we're approaching it through a lens, and there's a lot of other ways you could approach it. We're saying, well, the politics have these effects, on these other areas, but you could also look at it the other way and say trade has an effect on these areas, or North Korea, or what have you. But I think it's also important that we look at, for them, we try to place ourselves in their shoes. What is the risk reward scenario of what is a win for them in this case? Because I think you could look at it and say a win is getting back to quote unquote normal with the U.S., which might mean giving in, or a win is this is our chance to seize the day. If played right, we let things degrade far enough and it gives us, and I'm not talking about necessarily World War III. I mean, that is one way you could go with seize the day, but I'm not thinking that, because China isn't, stupid. Again, are they going to admit it and talk about it a lot? Of course not. But you can do the math. Their military isn't even close to the size or strength of ours. And when you look at how many times over we could fight the next 7 countries in line with no problem, it's really not that realistic that would be the route that they would probably try, unless they, again, like Lance said, unless they honestly feel that there's no other choice, right?
Why? Right. But what I'm saying is it's not that cut and dry.
Yeah.
But this could be, to use the phrase slippery slope, that you cause unrest all across Southeast Asia. You get the Russians involved. You already have problems in Syria with controlling the Russians. You now have problems with the Saudis, it looks like, and Turkey and the way they're behaving. And you've implemented sanctions that are going to start in the next 2 or 3 weeks with Iran, which is driving up the price of oil and causing problems within OPEC. And you put all these things together and you're creating an awful lot of disruption in the world. And you may not be able to control the fallout. It may not be China and the United States. It may not be in Southeast Asia, which I think very likely could if I were a betting person, but it could be in the Middle East. It could be over oil. It could be over, religion, all kinds of things. When you start talking about the Turkish government and the Saudis.
Because it brings in so many parties that's where I understand.
It's not just the United States and China. I guess that's my point.
There's a gamble on this that it can be only that. And the question is whether or not.
And it could work out really well for us.
Right. It could. But also on the other side, there's that slippery slope of when you get too many other parties involved, it becomes the kind of thing where no matter how powerful you are, it's just not realistic to be able to manage the whole situation very effectively.
Events could spiral out of control. And I mean that quite literally, to where it doesn't matter that you're the world power. There are too many different players and you don't have necessarily relationships with them to control what happens.
Right. Even if you're more powerful than them, if you don't have any strong economic tie to them, there's not a lot of, pressure that you can exert other than outright military confrontation.
And all I'm saying is, I'm not saying World War III. All I'm saying is the precursors are in place. We're claiming nationalism. We only worry about ourselves. We don't care what's happening in the rest of the world. And now we're upsetting the apple cart in the rest of the world. We're kind of playing around with other countries' economies to the benefit of ours alone. Something could happen between two countries that we haven't even mentioned yet. And we're going to ignore it because it doesn't affect us. But eventually we may have to get involved in something. That's a direction that these things could go. I'm not saying it's the direction it's going to go because I don't have a crystal ball. Right. But this is the risk you run when you start playing with another major country's economy like the United States has decided to do with China.
We'll find out here in a moment Lance's official opinion on which scenario that he's outlined is more likely. But before we get to that, it's important to note why we're talking about this. As you know, the State of Us is here to do a better job than the mainstream media of either paying more attention to issues that they fail to pay attention to, or paying a better kind of attention to issues that they're focused on the wrong side of. And with that, as part of the TrueChat network, all the podcasts here at TrueChat pursue a common goal, which is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. If you think that we're not upholding that standard to the fullest, we encourage you to email ethics@truechat.org. Again, that's ethics@truechat.org. Also take this opportunity to invite you, what scenario do you think is more likely? And if there's one that Lance and I haven't included in the many plethora of choices, please first let us know what we failed to mention. And then second, let me know at TrueChat.org, at TrueChat.org, Facebook and Twitter, what you think the most likely outcome of this is. Does the U.S. get what we want, kind of like we did with Canada and Mexico, or does it start to spiral out of control the way that Lance has outlined one of the scenario possibilities? What do you think is the most likely? Obviously, none of us know for sure what's going to happen. And with that, we'll turn back to Lance now. We've given him a chance to mull it all over and give us his thoughts on what the most likely outcome is from your historical and personal perspective, morphed into that one final opinion.
I really think we're playing with fire. And when you play with fire, you get burned. That's my belief. So I don't think this will end.
It won't end the way that Mexico, Canada did, with a new agreement that we get some wins on. And
I'll be honest with you, those of you who listen to this show know that I'm more of a pessimist than I am an optimist. So understand that and being truthful in my reporting here. I tend to go more pessimistically. Right. But I don't think it has to go all the way to where something bad happens. But I think the likelihood of negativity coming, at least in Southeast Asia, happening, is greater than this working out in favor of the United States. I think it's going to destabilize North and South Korea and China and the United States and all of the relationships that we've been trying to develop there. Now, what I don't know, because I'm not privy to it, is this all part of the big picture that the Trump government wants to have happen? Was all of this with North Korea and everything a ploy leading up to this for the U.S. to gain? Is it just to gain trade superiority with China? Is all of this part of the plan, and that's all that we want? I just hope they realize that they're playing with fire and that they're careful, and that trade is all that comes out of this. And I'm afraid it's not. My faith, as you know, in the Trump administration and the Trump government is they're not sure what they're doing. However, to be fair, there have been some things that played out in ways that I didn't think they would in the first 2 years. So maybe they know what they're doing and things will work out with trade.
Well, and there is something to be said because we assume, right, that the tough on trade with China is the result to get a better deal through a similar process of U.S.-Mexico. But I think what you raise, and the reason I was shuffling through the papers here is I wanted to find this piece. I think this is part of what you raise. The Wall Street Journal says, there are some aspects of the administration's policy that the Chinese welcome, such as the suspension of U.S. military exercises in South Korea. But the Chinese are also worried that the U.S. Could use a denuclearization accord to expand its influence into North Korea, or that rapid change might destabilize Mr. Kim's regime. His comments appeared to suggest that the U.S. shouldn't take Beijing's cooperation on North Korea for granted. And my point here is it doesn't specifically spell this out, and by no means am I saying the Wall Street Journal is suggesting this, but I think there's some decent evidence to indicate that one strategy on this could be, right, when you burn it all down, from the ashes, you get to rebuild it. So there could be an idea here of the goal isn't to simply get a better trade deal. It is to destabilize that region, but make sure that we're the ones that pick up most of the pieces.
And because China doesn't want that.
No,
because if you go back to the history, you can't go back, right? But if you go to the history, that's why China became so involved in the Korean conflict, is they didn't want a
They don't like us
U.S.
that
led in Asia, in their land.
They still don't.
Right.
Just to be fair.
So,
they don't like that we're there.
if North Korea and South Korea were to ever come together as one country, now you would have a situation where both China and the United States would want to be its number one ally. So
Sure.
you would have a conflict of some kind. Doesn't necessarily have to be an armed conflict, but a conflict of some kind between the United States and China as to who would be the major diplomatic and trade player in a new one Korea, if that were to happen.
Yeah, I think, well, and that's where there could be.
There are a lot of ifs there.
Yeah, there could be, and there again, I'm starting with an if for the basis of this. There could be, I'm sure, gamed out a strategic. I'm trying to think of the right word. A strategic goal to destabilize the area, a managed destabilization, if you will, not just North Korea, but some of China's other close trading partners, including them. If you can strategically allow their economies to slip, even though you suffer short-term losses, in the long term, you might be able to be the one then that comes in and picks up a lot of those pieces. Because we know that, Trump views, at least through his public comments, China as kind of our number one adversary. Yeah, I said it right. Did you see that? Or I said it the American way. It doesn't mean it's right. But there's that opportunity, I think, that you could be looking at to say, this is a way that we knock them down a peg. And yeah, it's risky, but maybe it's a calculated thing where they think it's worth the risk. And again, as I say with all of this, because I think it's just so important to highlight, Lance and I can only view this through the information available to us. There's so many things, regardless of what you think of the administration, that they're privy to that we just simply aren't. That none of the news media, that Lance and I, that we never get to know, that make a huge difference to how you make these decisions. So again, we're viewing it based off of, we don't have the United States military intelligence that would make, I'm sure, a difference to how we're looking at this.
But President Trump's admiration of Vladimir Putin is also in play here, because word is that there are negotiations between Russia and North Korea for a state visit by the North Korean president to Russia to see Vladimir Putin.
Well, sure.
So not only are
Russia wants a piece of it if they can get it.
But it's not just, that's my point, is you're not necessarily just controlling this with China, because now you have Putin, and then you have Putin in Syria, and then you have Putin in Iran, and the oil embargoes and oil prices and the destabilization of the economy. There are lots of pieces. You just can't, I think it's unfair to look at it just under the lens of US and China.
Yeah. Because it isn't.
That's all I say for today's episode. I just think that's not a good way to look at this. I think there are a lot more pieces involved that people aren't talking about.
We live in a world economy, whether or not we want to accept it. Every time we make decisions, the world's two largest economies, it has large ripple effects. It always does, because so many are dependent on us in one way or another. So we'll leave you with that to think about. Again, I want your comments, though. What scenario do you think is the most likely? At TrueChat.org, Facebook, Twitter, and more. And of course, you can listen to TrueChat Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and anywhere that fine podcasts are found. For The State of Us on TrueChat in Urbana, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Thank you very much for tuning in. We'll see you next time on The State of Us. Be the change.